Okay guys, good morning. Today is Tuesday, May 19th. We're going to go ahead and continue our ELA for this week. This week we are going to be reading two stories like usual. I have my pen here in case I want to make any notes. And we are going to begin by reading our first story. Our first story is going to be a nonfiction story, and it's going to be an excerpt, another excerpt. Remember we talked about last week when we read the excerpt from Jules Verne? Again, we're going to read another excerpt from Jules Verne. Excerpt meaning a portion of a story that was taken out of. So this story that we're reading, this 5-page story that we're reading, is going to be a portion of this 7-page story that we're about to read is an excerpt from one of Jules Verne's other stories. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Everyone, we're going to go ahead and start with page 12. And again, remember, you can either have your physical booklet or I post the digital versions of the stories on Google Classroom as well as in the Dropbox link that is sent out to everyone. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and start with our beginning of our first story. It's called, on page 12, We Continue Our Descent, an excerpt from Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth. I'm going to go ahead and read. Well, if I decide something is important for us to point out as a key event, I'm going to go ahead and announce it to you guys. Because our activity tomorrow, we talk about key events from the story. So it's just going to be an easy way for us to make sure that we remember what we talked about. Okay, so Jules Verne classic science fiction novel Journey to the Center of the Earth in 1864 tells of a daring expedition by a group of scientists who hope to discover how Earth was formed and what's in its core. The expedition, led by Professor Hardwigg, includes his nephew Harry, a budding scientist, and their guide Hans. Verne, acknowledged as the father of modern science fiction, weaves current scientific information from a time into the story, such as Humphrey Davy's theory of volcanic energy. So this piece that I'm reading right here on this first page is going to be background information on the story. And then on the next page is when I'll start the story. But I'll make sure to announce where the excerpt is actually beginning from. Davy is famous for discovering and separating chemical elements believed that Earth's core and volcanoes happened as a result of these chemical changes. Some of his contemporaries also believed erroneously that volcanoes and Earth's cores were not extremely hot. Verne also brings in scientific tools that for a time were on the cutting edge of technology. The Ruhmkorff coil apparatus, an electric lighting device, was a precursor to the modern flashlight. Whether invoking science theories or facts or inventing science to suit his fiction, Verne knew it was important to learn about Earth's core to better understand how Earth was formed. In the excerpt from chapter 15, the men in the expedition have gone to Iceland and are now descending through a volcano cone on their journey to the center of the Earth. So this page is really about the background of the story itself, Journey to the Center of the Earth, for us as the reader to understand what we're about to read. So if we flip over to the next page, this is going to be the excerpt meaning portion of the story that we're about to read. Okay, so now, Harry, cried the professor in his enthusiastic tone of voice, we truly are about to take our first step into the interior of the Earth, never before visited by a man since the first creation of the world. You may consider, therefore, that at this precise moment our travels really commence. As my uncle made this remark, he took in one hand the Ruhmkorff coil apparatus, which hung around his neck. So pausing right there, they're talking about, remember how we talked about last page, how Jules Verne used actual scientific tools and technologies that were around in the world today in his stories, which kind of pushed that and further understood the science elements of his stories. Which hung around his neck, and with the other he put the electric current into communication with the worm of the lantern, and the bright light at once illuminated the dark, gloomy tunnel. The effect was magical. Hans, who carried the second apparatus, had it also put into operation. The indigenous application of electricity to practical purposes enabled us to move along by light of artificial day, and made even the flow of the most inflammable and combustible gases. "Forward!" cried my uncle. Each took us his burden. Hans went first, my uncle followed, and I going third. We entered the somber gallery. Just when we were about to engulf ourselves into this dismissal passage, I lifted my head, even though it was a tube-like shaft, saw the Iceland sky I was never to see again. Okay, so this is kind of giving us that background of they're about to enter into the volcano, what did he call it? Into the volcano cone. So it's kind of talking about they're about to go into the volcano cone, and they turned on their version of the flashlight to be able to see. That's kind of what, so I don't see anything right here being a key point or a key event, but I am going to underline the, I'm going to squiggle underline the Ruhmkorff-Coil apparatus, because that's kind of like a key technological advancement that was around during that day. And I'm going to draw an arrow, and I'm going to write science technology next to it so that I know it's an actual science technology that was around in this era. And I'm going to write next to it in quotation marks, I'm going to write modern day flashlight. Just so I know when I see this, I have that fact that I already written this down, and it helped me understand. So whenever I see this word, I'm going to think, oh, that was a flashlight. So let's go to the next page. Okay. What is the last I should ever see of any skies? The stream of lava flowing from the bowels of the earth in the year 1219 had forced itself a passage through the tunnel, and it lined the whole of the inside with its thick and brilliant coating. The electric light added very greatly to the brilliancy of this effect. Moving on to paragraph 9. The great difficulty of our journey now began. How we can prevent ourselves from slipping down the steeply inclined plane. Happily, some cracks, abrasures of the soil, and other irregularities served the place of steps, and we descended slowly, thus allowing our heavy luggage to slip on before at the end of a long cord. But that was which served as steps under our feet became other places stylicities. The lava, very porous in certain places, took the form little round blisters. Crystals of opaque quartz adorned with lumid drops of natural gas, suspended to the roof like lustres, seemed to take fire as we passed beneath them. Once one would have fancied that the genii of romance were illuminating their underground palaces to receive the sons of men. Okay, so that paragraph was kind of confusing. So let's break it down a little bit. So it's talking about how when going through this cone, this volcanic cone, they had to use, they wasn't like cut out steps, right? They had to use the cracks in the surface to be able to walk their way slowly. However, they were saying that the lava was more present in certain areas, so you had to be careful to step. And they also said that it took the place of little round blisters, like little small circles, so you might even miss it sometimes. So you had to be very careful on where you were stepping. And they were talking about how crystals of quartz were like icicles coming from the ceiling. So they referenced glass, right? Were coming from the roof, and so you had to be careful not to move too much to be able to shake it, so the glass icicles wouldn't fall, and they were really sharp. So basically, it's just talking about what they were seeing when they were walking through. I hope that helped with the understanding. I know the author used some very descriptive figurative language in the text, so it's kind of difficult for someone to understand. But when we broke it down, you can really see that they were just describing what the cone, the volcanic cone, looked like and what their mission was to go through that. So, okay, let's go to the next page. 11. Magnificent, glorious, I cried in the moment of involuntary enthusiasm. What a spectacle, uncle. Do you not admire this variegated shades of lava which run through the whole series of colors from reddish brown to pale yellow by the most insatiable degrees, and these crystals appear like luminous globes. You are the beginning to see the charms of travel, Master Harry, cried my uncle. Wait a bit until we advance further, when we must yet discover nothing. Onwards, my boy, onwards. So, I'm going to go ahead and underline the part where it says, the great difficulty of our journey now began in paragraph 9. And we're going to talk about how I'm going to underline inclined plane, and I'm going to underline and I'm going to put an arrow next to where we underlined of the first sentence in paragraph 9. And I'm going to write key event, question mark, because this kind of goes into a key event, but talks about how they first entered the cone, but also kind of we may or may not use it when we talk about our activity for tomorrow, but it's still important to kind of point out. So underneath key event question mark, I'm going to put a bullet point, and I'm going to write entering into the volcanic cone for the first time. Okay, so let's go ahead and flip to page 16. We're going to go ahead and start on paragraph 13. It would have been far more correct and appropriate expression had he said, let us slide, for we're going down an inclined plane with perfect ease. The compass indicated that we were moving in a southeasterly direction. The flow of lava had never been turned to the right or to the left. It had the inflexibility of a straight line. Nevertheless, to my surprise, we had found no perceptible increase in heat. This proved the theories of Humphrey Davy to be founded on truth, and more than once I found myself examining the thermometer in silent astonishment. 2 hours after our departure, it only marked 54 degrees Fahrenheit. I had every reason to believe that this was our descent was far more horizontal than vertical. As for discovering the exact depth to which we had attained, nothing could be easier. The professor, as he advanced, measured the angles of deviation and inclination, but he kept the result of his observations to himself. About 8 o'clock in the evening, my uncle gave the signal for halting. Hans seated himself on the ground. The lamps were hung to fissures in the lava rock. We are now in a large cave-in where air was not wanting. On the contrary, it abounded. What could be the cause of this? To this atmospheric agitation could ascribe this draft. But this was a question which I did not care to discuss just then, as fatigue and hunger made me incapable of reasoning. An unceasing march of 7 hours had not been kept up with great exhaustion. I was dearly, truly worn out, and delighted enough when I would hear the word halt. So they're talking about how they continued their journey inside further into the volcanic cone, and they were saying how 2 hours into the departure, they figured that it would be much more, the temperature would be much higher because they're going inside the volcanic cone. However, that wasn't the case. Moving on to paragraph 17. Hans laid out some provisions on a lump of lava, and we each supped with keen relish. One thing, however, that caused us great uneasiness was our water reserve was already half exhausted. My uncle had full confidence in finding subterranean resources, but hitherto we had completely failed in doing so I could not help calling my uncle's attention to the circumstances. Are you surprised with the total absence of springs? So let's underline our water reserve was already half exhausted. And I'm going to draw an arrow, and I'm going to write another key event question mark. And I'm going to put a bullet, and I'm going to say a bullet point, and I'm going to say water source almost out. Because this is kind of the point in the story where the characters have to come together and see where they're going to find the source of water. And at the end it says, when he asks, "Are you surprised at this total absence of springs? Would you think because the volcanic water is, it's not salt water, it's pure water, you're able to drink it." And he was saying, "Are you surprised that there's no water? Like, are you surprised at the fact that there's no water present?" So let's go ahead and flip on to the next page. And we're going to go to paragraph 18. "Doubtless I am very uneasy onto the point where we have certainly not enough water to last us 5 days. Be quite easy on the matter," continued my uncle. "I answer, for we shall find plenty of water. In fact, far more than we shall want. But when we get through this crust of lava, how can you expect springs to force their way through these solid stone walls? But what is there to prove that this concrete mass of lava does not extend to the center of the earth? I don't think we have as yet done much in a vertical way." "What puts that into your head, my boy?" asked my uncle mildly. "Well, it appears to me that we have descended very far below the level of sea. We should find it rather hotter than we have, according to our system," said my uncle. "But what does the thermometer say?" "Scarcely 15 degrees by Romier, which is only an increase of 9 since our departure." "Well, what is the conclusion does that bring you to?" inquired the professor. Flipping over to the next page. "The deduction I draw from this is very simple. According to the most exact observations, the augmentation of the temperature of the interior of the earth is 1 degree for every 100 feet. Let's go ahead and underline that. Interior of the earth, I want to say the temperature of the interior of the earth is 1 degree for every 100 feet. But certain local causes may considerably modify this figure. The difference evidently depends on the conductibility of certain rocks. In the neighborhood of extinct volcano, it has been marked that the elevation of temperature was only 1 degree in every 5 and 20 feet. Let us then go upon this calculation which is most favorable, and calculate. Calculate away, my boy. Nothing easier, said I, pulling out my notebook and pencil. 9 times 125 feet make a depth of 1125 feet. 1125 feet. Archimedes could have never spoken more geometrically. Well, according to my observations, we are at least 10,000 feet below sea level. Can it be possible? Either my calculation is correct or there is no truth in figures. The calculations of the professor were perfectly correct. We were already 6,000 feet deeper down in the bowels of the earth than anyone had ever been before. The lowest known depth of which man had hitherto penetrated was in the mines of Kitzbühel in the Tyrol of those in Württemberg. The temperature would have been 81 with only 51, the matter of serious consideration. So I'm going to go ahead and underline we were already 6,000 feet deeper in the bowels of the earth than anyone has ever been before. And I'm going to draw an arrow and I'm going to write key event, question mark. This is kind of just notes for me to look back on. And I'm going to say reaching the farthest into the earth than anyone before. Okay, so that wraps up our first story. Let me go ahead and flip over to our next story. So our next story is called Jules Verne, Master of Science Fiction. It's going to be a background on Jules Verne. Jules Verne was an actual writer who wrote in the science fiction genre, also known as the founder of science fiction or the father of science fiction. So our first story was nonfiction, right? Because it contained those aspects of being creative and not necessarily based on true events, but elaborated to a more creative element. And this story is going to be fiction because it's talking about the life of Jules Verne. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on page 20. I'm going to start at the top. Jules Verne, Master of Science Fiction. Jules Verne, 1828 to 1905, grew up in the seaport city of Nantes, France in 1830s. As a boy, he enjoyed watching ships travel to and from the port. Perhaps that's what sparked his imagination to write about fascinating voyages. Verne's father, a practical man, wanted his son to be a lawyer, so Verne went on to study law, but gave it up to write stories. When he couldn't earn a living as a writer, Verne became a stockbroker but continued writing on the side. Being a stockbroker gave him enough financial stability to get married in 1857 and start a family. However, Verne never gave up on his writing, and in 1862 his persistence finally paid off. He met with the publisher, Pierre-Jules Hetzel, who agreed to publish Verne's first novel, 5 Weeks in a Balloon. It was a unique story of 3 explorers who traveled to Africa in a hot air balloon. It blended science and adventure so realistically that many readers wondered whether if it was fact or fiction. It became an international bestseller. Verne's next book, The Adventures of Captain Hatteras, described a voyage to the Arctic. Then he wrote Journey to the Center of the Earth, which many believe was his finest work. In both novels, he included scientific theories about Earth's evolution. His next books, From the Earth to the Moon and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, were written long before space and submarine travels became realities. He followed with the lighthearted novel Around the World in 80 Days. Jules Verne had a very unique style that combined science and adventure to make his stories seem real. He has inspired the imaginations of millions of readers, including famous scientists and inventors. His timeless novels will no doubt continue to inspire for future generations. So it's really talking about how Jules Verne really took the science fiction world by storm by creating this sort of world within his stories, how you almost couldn't tell whether it was real or not real, because he combined scientific theories as well as using his creativity in his stories and language to be able to incorporate this sort of world that engulfed meaning surrounded its reader to the point where they almost believed that what they were reading was true, right? And it talks about how his stories have been talked about for years to come, and we're still here talking about it in 2020 about his stories that were written in 1860. So it also really talks about how he never truly gave up on his dream, right? He became a stockbroker to financially support himself. However, in the end, his stories is what created his legacy to last this long. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up ELA for today, and we're going to go right into social studies. Okay guys, good morning. We're going to go ahead and jump into our social studies lesson for today. We're going to be continuing where we left off and read the second page of our newspaper for this week. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. So we're going to go ahead and start with, at the top of the page, Alexander's first victory. King Philip II of Macedonia and Queen Olympias had their son Alexander in 365 BCE. A story tells that on the day of his birth, 2 of Zeus's eagles perched on the roof of the palace. Other legends tell of a star falling to the earth and a lightning strike at a faraway Asian temple. Some say these were signs that the child would be important one day. Alexander learned to play the lyre and flute and liked swimming, racing, hunting, and horseback riding. He was a great athlete and was asked to compete in the Olympic Games. Alexander said if he could compete against kings in the Olympic Games, he would do so, otherwise he wasn't interested. When Alexander was 16 years old, his father left him in charge of Macedonia when Philip went to Byzantium to fight in a battle. The people of Macedonia decided to rebel since Alexander was just a teenager. Bad idea. Alexander led the army and quickly got the rebels under control. He also renamed the city Alexandropolis in his own honor. Alexander named many cities after himself. So when we talked about in yesterday's lesson, when we first were learning about Alexander the Great, we talked about how he named a lot of cities that he conquered after himself, right? So this is just another example of how he took this sort of realm and made it into his own. Okay, so continuing on the next one, horsing around. Young Alexander noticed that none of his father's soldiers could tame a black colt. At 12 years old, Alexander said if he could tame the horse and that his father's soldiers lacked skill and courage, his father thought this might be a good lesson for his son. Because Alexander sounded conceited and had insulted the soldiers, if Alexander could train the wild horse, King Philip said he would give him the colt. If he failed, Alexander would have to pay the horse dealer for the black colt with his own money. Speaking kindly, Alexander first turned to the horse to face a different direction. He had noticed the horse was afraid of its shadow. Alexander tamed the horse, and his father kept his promise. King Philip was very proud of his son. Alexander named his horse Bucephalus. Bucephalus accompanied him in many battles and traveled as far as India. When his horse died, Alexander named a city after him. This is the story that helps us understand more about Alexander's character and his accomplishment. But taming the horse isn't the defining moment of Alexander's life. He went on to build one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. So let's go on to the next section, the Gordian Knot. In the city of Gordium, a legend said that anyone who came to the town and solved the puzzle of their framed knot would rule the entire world. The story told of an ox cart that had extremely difficult, complicated knot, which had been made to honor the chief god Zeus. The ends of the knot were hidden within the knot itself, so no one could figure out how to untie it. So, moving on to the bottom of the newspaper, the culture section. We're going to go ahead and start there. So, the wisdom of the woodcutter. A woodcutter finished chopping down trees. So, woodcutter meaning exactly what it entails, right? Their job was to cut down trees and collect wood and bring it back to the village to either sell or to use to build. Okay? So, when they reference the woodcutter, that was a person whose only job was to cut down wood. So a woodcutter finished chopping down trees to sell in the market and walked out of the forest with his load of branches. Because some of the branches were very long, he called, "Look out," as he carried the branches to town. A very rich man heard "Look out" as he stepped into the road, but the man refuses to get out of the way of the woodcutter's branches. The branches ripped his clothes. The rich man was so angry and decided to take the woodcutter to court to get him to pay for his new clothes. In court, the woodcutter didn't speak, even when the judge asked him to tell his side of the story. Since the judge didn't know the woodcutter, he assumed that he was mute or unable to speak. The judge turned to the wealthy man and asked, "Why would you bring such a man to court?" The wealthy man said the woodcutter was not mute, just too arrogant to speak in court. The judge asked, "Why would you say that?" The wealthy man said to the judge, "Because he yelled, 'Look out,' as he brought the tree limbs to the market." The judge looked at the rich man and said, "If the woodcutter told you to get out of the way, why didn't you?" The rich man had no reply. The judge ruled that the woodcutter did not owe the man any money for clothes because the wealthy man should have heeded the woodcutter's warning. Heeded meaning he should have listened to when he said to get out of the way, right? So, on this page of the newspaper, you can see this big bottom part of the map, and you can see just how huge Alexander the Great's empire was, right? At the time, it was the largest in the world. He was told, because the New World hadn't been discovered yet, he was told that this is as far as he could go. Like, there was no more that he could expand to. So, we're looking at our key points for today. So we have, our first one is King Philip II of Macedonia. So King Philip II, I'm going to say, was original ruler of Macedonia. Okay, and then I'm going to say was Alexander the Great the Great's father. Okay, so
Thank you.
we continue with King Philip II was the original ruler of Macedonia. He was also Alexander the Great's father, right? And they were saying the day that Alexander was born, there's theories that 2 of Zeus's eagles landed on the temple, or that a lightning strike happened in a shooting star, all of which proved that Alexander was meant to be great. So, at the young age of 16, Alexander the Great was left as the ruler of Macedonia when his father went to battle, right? And they were saying how a lot of people started to rebel because they felt that the boy was too young to rule. However, in this aspect, when they started to rebel, he quickly got control of the rebels and took back control of the city, which really proved to everyone that he was going to be a great leader. Okay, so moving on to our next one, Bucephalus. I think that's how you pronounce it. So he was Alexander the Great. I'm going to say Alexander the Great's horse, right? He led Alexander on all of his battles. He accompanied him all. And then when the horse passed away, I'm going to put in quotation marks, named a city after him. So he named one of his conquered cities after his horse. And again, remember when we talked about in one of the stories on our page, when we talked about how he was tasked with training a wild horse that no one else could train, none of his other soldiers. And Alexander the Great told his father that all of his other soldiers were unable to do it. They were not strong enough. They did not have the willpower to train the horse. And a lot of them were hurt by his comments. So Alexander's father said, you know what, fine, you want to be conceited and say that you can do this, so you're going to do it. And if you can't, you have to pay the horse trainer with your own money. But if you can, you get to keep the horse. And so what did Alexander the Great do? He tamed the horse, and then the horse later became his horse, which followed him on all of his battles until the very end when the horse passed away. And he named one of his cities that he conquered after his horse. So that's all that we are going to talk about today. And then tomorrow, we'll go ahead and finish with page 3 of the newspaper. And then I will see you then.